In 1941, Canada faced a problem it could not solve with soldiers. The men were leaving, the factories were emptying, and the war was just beginning. So the country turned to a group it had never fully trusted inside those spaces before. Women who had never been expected to build weapons were now asked to produce them. Not someday, not gradually, but immediately. What followed was not just a shift in labor, it was a quiet transformation that helped sustain an entire war. And when it ended, most of it was expected to disappear. Before we continue with the full story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, your city and country. Now, let us return to the beginning, to a moment when the war was not only fought overseas but quietly, inside factories across Canada. By the time Canada entered the Second World War in September 1939, its industrial capacity was still recovering from a decade of economic depression. Factories were under-equipped and staffed largely by men who had grown up in an era when heavy manufacturing was considered a male domain. As enlistment accelerated through 1940 and 1941, those men began to disappear from production lines, workshops, and assembly floors. They left behind machines that still needed operators, quotas that still needed filling, and a war that demanded more equipment each month than the previous one. This was not a problem that could be solved by working existing employees harder. Canada needed new workers, hundreds of thousands of them. The math pointed in one direction. Women accounted for more than half the adult population. They were largely outside the industrial workforce. And there was no other available pool of labor of comparable size. In March 1942, Ottawa took the unprecedented step of registering all women born between 1918 and 1922 into the National Selective Service System, establishing a mechanism to direct their labor where it was most needed. 2 months later, in May 1942, the federal government formalized the recruitment effort through the creation of a women's division within the Department of National Selective Service, actively placing women in sectors facing the most acute shortages. The industrial targets set against these measures were not modest. By 1943, approximately 261,000 Canadian women were directly involved in the production of war goods, accounting for more than 30% of the aircraft industry and close to 50% of the workforce in many gun plants. At peak production in 1943 and 1944, 373,000 women were working across Canadian manufacturing, of whom the majority were in munitions and related war production. But reaching those numbers required more than bureaucratic directives. It required changing what millions of Canadians believed was possible, acceptable, and appropriate. The challenge was not only logistical, it was cultural. Canadian society in the early 1940s operated on assumptions about gender that had been reinforced for generations. Heavy industry was male territory, not by formal law, but by habit, expectation, and the quiet enforcement of social norms. A woman entering a factory was not simply taking a job, she was crossing an invisible boundary, and the government understood that simply opening the doors would not be enough. The national communication effort that followed was deliberate, coordinated, and carefully calibrated. Canada could not afford social disruption at precisely the moment national unity was most essential. So the approach did not frame industrial work as liberation or transformation. It framed it as duty, an extension of the roles women already occupied, a wartime contribution to something larger than any individual. The National Film Board of Canada, which had been legislated by an order of the Privy Council in 1941 to function as the country's official photographer and film producer, became the primary vehicle for this national effort. Short films were produced and screened at cinemas across the country, reaching audiences who had not come to be persuaded, but who stayed to watch regardless. Posters appeared at factory gates, train stations, community halls, and shop windows. The NFB produced a recruitment film in 1943 titled Proudly She Marches, aimed at the Canadian Women's Army Corps, that deliberately emphasized cohesion, discipline, and pride without any suggestion that femininity was being abandoned. A parallel poster campaign placed women shoulder to shoulder with men, with the message that this was their battle too. Every element of this coordinated effort served the same objective. Lower the threshold of hesitation without raising the alarm about permanence. The imagery was precise. Women were shown at work, but never overwhelmed. Machines appeared powerful, yet controlled. Faces were calm. Hair was neatly tied. Uniforms were practical but tailored. The conditions inside these factories were demanding, but the national messaging chose to foreground competence over hardship. The message was not false, but it was selective. In May 1941, one woman became one of the most recognizable faces of the entire wartime campaign. Veronica Foster, a young worker from Toronto, was employed at the John Inglis company plant on Strachan Avenue, assembling Bren light machine guns on a production line alongside more than 14,000 other women. The facility was extraordinary in scale, covering 23 acres and over 1 million square feet of floor space. Between 1939 and 1945, the plant produced more than 40,000 Bren guns for British and Canadian forces. Those weapons would be carried by Canadian soldiers overseas, used in the fields of Normandy, the hills of Italy, and the forests of the Netherlands. What was assembled in Toronto echoed across every theatre where Canadians fought. The NFB, as the country's official photographer, selected Foster for a wartime communication campaign. The resulting photographs became some of the most widely reproduced wartime images in Canadian history. The most famous showed her holding a Bren gun casually, a cigarette between her lips, her expression calm, almost indifferent to the weapon in her arms. She would later tell her family she had never actually smoked. The cigarette was placed there by the photographer. This detail, trivial in isolation, captured something essential about the entire campaign. It was not fabricated. Foster was a real worker. The guns were real. The factory was real. But every element of the image had been chosen to communicate something specific: competence, ease, normalcy. A woman doing demanding work without losing herself in the process. The photograph appeared on the front page of the New York Times on October 4, 1941, as part of a feature on women in the Canadian war industry. Other images in the same series showed Foster dancing, attending social events, carrying on a life outside the factory floor. The national communication logic was clear. Showing a woman beside a weapon and then dancing afterward told a different story than showing exhaustion and oil stains. The message was aimed not just at potential workers, but at the families and communities who would need to accept their participation. Women were not being depicted as replacements for men. They were being depicted as contributors, women temporarily stepping into spaces left by absent fathers, brothers, and husbands. The distinction addressed the most significant cultural obstacle directly. A temporary contribution did not threaten the social order. It honored it. The approach worked. By war's end, close to 800,000 Canadian women had entered manufacturing plants producing war materials. They assembled weapons, built aircraft, operated machinery previously considered beyond their physical or technical capability. Supervisors who had resisted their arrival reported that women mastered complex operations quickly, maintained production rates that met or exceeded expectations, and brought a precision to inspection tasks that proved essential to quality control. Behind the carefully framed photographs, the reality of wartime factory work was considerably more demanding than any national campaign image suggested. The shifts began before dawn and ended well after dark. Inside the Inglis plant and dozens like it across the country, the noise was relentless, a constant metallic rhythm that workers stopped hearing after a while, not because it disappeared, but because there was no quiet left to compare it to. The air smelled of cutting oil and hot steel. Floors vibrated. Munitions plants carried real physical risks. Exposure to chemicals and metal dust accumulated invisibly over months and years. Accidents occurred, some serious, and they were rarely reported publicly. The war at home produced costs that no official tally recorded. Women adapted to those conditions without the benefit of any formal acknowledgement that the adaptation was exceptional. Many arrived from across the country, having never left their home communities, drawn by wages that offered stability after a decade of Depression-era hardship. Housing near production centers was scarce. Government-built facilities filled quickly. Some women shared rooms. Others commuted long distances before and after shifts that left little time for anything else. Inside the plants, mistakes had a weight that ordinary employment never carried. A misaligned component on an assembly line was not simply a production error, it was a weapon that might fail. Women understood this without being told. When a worker at the Inglis plant discovered a flaw in a finished trigger mechanism late in her shift, she stopped the line herself. A decision that cost the plant 17 minutes of production and earned her a formal reprimand from her floor supervisor. She kept working the next day. So did the others around her. For women whose husbands, brothers, or sons were already overseas, the awareness that what left their hands would eventually reach the front transformed the work into something that could not be easily described as employment. Some wrote to their men about it. Letters moving in both directions carried a vocabulary that had not existed before the war. A man writing from England described receiving a new Bren. He wrote that he had wondered, briefly, whose hands had built it. He did not know. She would never know he had wondered. That invisible thread between a factory floor in Toronto and a soldier in a field somewhere in Europe was never part of the national messaging. It did not need to be. The women already felt it. At the same time, the terms of participation were never equal in a formal sense. Wages for women performing identical tasks to men remained lower throughout the war. Employers argued that women carried different domestic responsibilities and therefore different financial needs. The logic was circular, widely understood as such, but difficult to challenge formally in a wartime environment that discouraged disruption in the name of national unity. There was also the question the national campaign had deliberately left unanswered. What would happen when the war ended? From the beginning, the messaging had emphasized the temporary nature of women's industrial contributions. This framing served its purpose in reducing cultural resistance at the point of recruitment, but it meant that the women entering factories did so without any assurance of permanence. They invested in skills, adapted to demanding conditions, and proved their competence across every available measure. They did so understanding, without it ever being stated openly, that the invitation had a limit. The end came quickly and without ceremony. In the weeks after Victory in Europe Day, production orders slowed. Lines were suspended. The rhythm that had defined the Inglis plant for 6 years fell quiet for the first time. Women received their notices by letter or through floor supervisors. Some had known it was coming for months. Others had not allowed themselves to think about it. The women who had maintained production at the John Inglis plant were not offered continued positions after the war. The pattern repeated across Canadian industry. Women classified as wartime hires found their engagement had fulfilled its stated purpose. The posters came down. The films stopped circulating. The national messaging that had spent years building the case for women in factories quietly reversed its direction. Some women went home to children who had grown while they were working nights. Some returned to towns they had left years earlier. Some stood on the floor of a plant they had given years to and simply looked around one last time before walking out. There were no speeches, no official thank you proportional to what had been contributed. What remained was something harder to see. By 1945, Canada had demonstrated something that its own assumptions had previously made invisible. Women could operate complex machinery. They could sustain production under pressure. They could enter roles defined as male and perform them without losing themselves in the process. The country had organized itself around that fact, depended on it, and produced the weapons that helped win a war because of it. That knowledge did not disappear when the factories closed. It stayed with the women who had carried it. Veronica Foster left the Inglis plant after the war and built a career as a singer with Mart Kenny and his Western Gentleman, eventually marrying a fellow musician named George Garrett, a trombonist, and settling in Edmundston, New Brunswick. Following his death in 1963, she returned to Toronto, where she worked as a real estate agent until her death in 2000. She did not often speak publicly about the factory years. In 2020, Canada Post honored her on a commemorative stamp marking the 75th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day, alongside the soldier Leo Major. The image chosen was the one from May 1941. The Bren gun, the overalls, the calm expression. She was 19 years old in that photograph. She had never smoked a cigarette in her life. And somewhere in Europe, in the months that followed, a Canadian soldier was carrying a weapon whose parts she had inspected, fitted, and approved. He did not know her name. She did not know his. That is perhaps the most honest account of what the home front actually was. Not a story of recognition, a story of presence, of work done quietly, in a loud place, for reasons that were never fully named,